Welcome to the BVTV network, coming to you from the UK studios of BizVision. I'm your host, Malcolm Gallagher. I'm a firm believer that today's leaders have to be even more skillful than yesterday's in the art of communication. Now, past leaders would often choose to remotely communicate from their remote office by the impersonal memo or email or even bland newsletter. Today's leaders have to master elements such as video, audio, tone, compassion, transparency, accountability, and much, much more. Communication has changed not just in its makeup, but also in its value, especially in building connections. We firmly know that here at BVTV. After all, we're in communication, but someone who knows it even more is my guest today. He's the author of this book. It's a cracking read. Ignition, Superior Communication Strategies for Creating Stronger Connections. Please meet Matthew L Moseley. Hello, Matthew.
Good morning, Malcolm, and hello. How are you? Thank you so much for having me on. It's great to be here.
What do you mean, good morning? We're way ahead of you. You know, this is England. We're ahead, aren't we? Whereabouts are you today, then, Matthew?
I am calling in and from Boulder, Colorado.
Tell us about Boulder, then.
It's a nice little town nestled in the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, right on the edge of where the plains meets the Rocky Mountains, and just a beautiful, beautiful town. I went on a hike this morning with my wife right out our back door. So yeah, things are good here. If we can just survive the forest fires and the drought, we'll all be good.
Right. Yeah. Yes, it is sad about all of that, isn't it? But that's called climate change. Matthew, your book is definitely a cracking and lively read. And I've got lots of favorite parts, such as the art of the meeting, OODA, and things like that within it. Oh, I particularly like the emotional journey. Very, very important. Viewers and listeners, I'll be talking to Matthew in 3 parts. In part 1, I'm asking Matthew to set the scene for us on the state of communications today. In part 2, I want to dive deeper with him. He is, after all, the holder of 3 world records for long distance swimming. Dive deeper into his focus on creating stronger connections through communication. And in part 3, I'm asking him to help you by revealing his choice of 3 skills to focus on now to improve your communication ability. But first, Matthew, tell us, who is Matthew L Moseley, and what brought you to write this book, Ignition?
Oh, you bet. You know, I've had a long and an interesting journey as a communications strategist and expert, and really trying to help organizations, companies, individuals tell a better story. I really believe and firmly believe in the unbridled power of good storytelling. Mm-hmm. And so all of our messaging, all of our communications should sort of strive towards that. And the book is a culmination of my life's journey of, you know, it has about 25 interviews over 24 chapters with a wide-ranging group of people, from astrophysicists to a fighter pilot who talks about how you use communications in a plane so that you don't actually die. We talk to the CEOs of companies, branding experts, a Disney producer, and the writer of the book Mean Girls that became the cult classic movie by Tina Fey. And so all of these folks bring a certain element of how they communicate as success and what it means to their success. Malcolm, I have a very firm belief through my 25 years on the front lines of really high stakes communications, in that it is impossible for anyone to lead or be successful without the skill and the art of communication. And I think that is so lost sometimes. People are so inside their own head. They're so concerned about their own product, but they don't think about how people are reacting to it. Yeah. And that's what I wanted to bring about with the book.
Excellent. Yes. And I can see it. I mean, I love the story with Nooch. He's the Disney producer, isn't he? Yeah. And the fighter pilot. Now, that brought me to be thinking how important it is to have clarity in communication, because too much communication is sort of so confusing. We've just been getting it here in the UK from our government, backwards and forwards on which countries you can't go to, which you couldn't go to, and confusion reigns.
It's absolutely maddening, isn't it? And I think right now we are at a point in our world where somehow we are so interconnected. I can be talking to you today from Boulder, Colorado to England, and yet somehow people are so isolated and they're so alone, and they've forgotten what it means to be connected to people and what that means to their own personal well-being, their success, and their happiness. And so I think because sometimes people are really, as you know this, they can be unclear. They're very ambiguous about what they want or what they mean. And we see that in relationships. We see that with bosses and our managers who, it's like, hey, just tell us what you want and we'll give it to you. Yes. And sometimes people don't know that. Yeah, and that's a big question. So I started this book about 6 years ago. It was actually, I was asked to give a talk on my work with Hunter S. Thompson, the late Gonzo journalist. His illustrator, Ralph Steadman, is a very popular figure over in the UK. But it was a talk on Gonzo communications at an event called Burning Man. And so it was all about how you put yourself in the story, and that in life, we should not just be a spectator, but we should actually be a participant in the events and the happenings around us, and not just an onlooker.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah. Matthew, time for part one. Let's set the scene for viewers and listeners. What's, in your mind, is the state of communications in business today? How has it changed recently, or how is it changing? And why should leaders make it a priority to improve their communication?
Absolutely. What a great question. Today, we are in a world where good, clear communications that builds trust is really in short supply. And we saw it over the last year with the pandemic, but it's really true always. We're always in a state of desperation in the world. There's always pandemics, there's wars, there's religions, there's constitution, political battles, Brexits, whatever, what have you. We're always in a state of change and flux. And that is why it's so important that companies and brands and organizations who communicated well over the last year, who communicated consistently and built trust with their stakeholders to say, hey, we are here for you. We're in this together. I believe, and I think we'll get in this a little bit later, but that it is impossible to get people to care about anything, your product, your business, your organization, education funding, saving the planet from climate change, unless you can get people to care about something.
Yes.
And unless they care, you can't have any action. And so that's what inspired me to write the book, was how do we get people to care about anything? Very simple question.
Yeah.
And so I came up with some of these strategies for how we can do that.
Yeah. I particularly, as I said beforehand, like the emotional journey. Is that what you're aiming to do, to grab people into the story?
Yes, that is so much it, is that when we think about planning our communications, and we'll talk about communications planning, which I'm a big advocate of, is that in the emotional journey, when we're talking with somebody, if we're sending out an email or a company missive or something, we want to think about what we want people to think, feel, and do. And that's the emotional journey. We want them to think about a certain way. We want them to feel, and we want them to care about it. Or maybe we don't want them to care about a certain issue. And then we want them to act and to do. We want them to buy the ticket and take the ride. And so that's what we're striving for. Communications in business is so much sometimes, and the leaders that I've worked with often, it's kind of an afterthought. It's sort of like, let's go do all this stuff, and then we'll tell people what we did later. And that's just really not the way to build trust with your customers or your stakeholders, is that you take them on an emotional journey. You
Yes.
don't just do it after the fact and say, all right, did you do this? Because you missed steps 1 and 2 about how to think and to feel.
Yeah, I think it's a little bit like, green issues and climate change and everything. And we're all too busy doing things, switching the lights on, driving here and everything like that. And, somebody's saying to us, yeah, the planet's going to melt. Well, it goes over your head, doesn't it? But then when it started resonating with me is one day when my wife said, what we're doing, we've got 4 grandchildren, by the way, Matthew, and you're thinking, what are we leaving for those 4 grandchildren by being our selfish ways at the moment? And that really grabbed me.
Yep.
It was that hook that grabbed me, and now we've got our program called Biz Neutral and we're out there shouting it out,
Yeah. Well, and it's not just climate change, but I talk about it in the 3rd part of the book, the sort of call to action of ignition in the book about why we should be creating these connections, why it should matter, is that the world is facing so many critical issues today. I work with clients across a broad range of issues. It's usually some kind of crisis situation, which is unfortunate because they don't think to call us before they're in a crisis, right? It's only when it's like, oh my gosh, the sky is burning. Yeah. What are we going to do?
It'll never happen to us.
Right. But we have an opportunity, especially for young people today in this world, to tackle some of the biggest issues of our time, whether it's water, whether it's public education funding and how people go to school, healthcare,
yes,
a big one. If we have access to doctors, transportation, a big one. How do we get around? These are some really thorny, big issues that not just we are facing in Colorado and in the United States, but these are global issues, and they seem to resonate across all societies. And so I wanted to give us some tools and a framework for how we could think about those issues. You may have remembered the book. There was a scholar named Yuval Harari who wrote a book, Sapiens. And that book influenced the writing of my own because in it, he translates and shows history of our very earliest time as grunts and groans and the first piece of art. And he says that across our development, communication and collaboration was our secret sauce as sapiens. We were able to beat out stronger, dinosaurs and other sapient tribes that were stronger and better and faster. But we were able to think of a greater good and to think of the common purpose and beyond just the tribe, kind of the bigger picture. And that's been our secret sauce throughout humanity of our survival. And so we have to get back there.
Yeah.
We have to think that this is going to be the one thing that can save us on this planet and that can make us have a better world together.
I totally agree. And we do need to go back into history at times. But I think, Matthew, before we continue to part 2, let me just remind viewers and listeners of your website address, URL, which is, now viewers, obviously you can see it on the screen behind me, but for listeners, I'm going to read it out and I'll take my time on this one. It's Matthew with 2 T's in the middle, Matthew, then there's an L, Matthew L Moseley, Moseley. Now, you should be able to know how to spell Mr. Moseley if you have watched Downton Abbey, because he was a very well-known character in it. But MatthewLMoseley.net, MatthewLMoseley.net. Your book is called Ignition, Superior Communication Strategies for Creating Stronger Connections, and it's published by Routledge. Matthew, as I said, it's a lively read. However, I felt that the best way was not to make it a fast read, but for me to read it a chapter at a time, then sitting back and reflecting on that chapter, especially from a personal point of view. Do you agree?
Oh, thank you very much. Yes, it is. It's not a long book, right? But it's a book that hopefully provokes thought. and that's where, it's interesting. Before I turned in the final manuscript, I gathered some of my friends together and we did a live reading cover to cover of the book. And what it brought out for me was that it was meant to be read slowly. It's not meant to be just speed read through, but there's a lot of big concepts in there. And so reading it aloud was a lot of fun. And it gave me, I would encourage every author, and even when you're writing a press release or an email, read it out loud first. And how does that sound? Because sometimes in our rapid communications pace, where we're just sending emails and text and they're just flying out of our fingers, we don't stop and think about the tone or the nuances and how other people are reacting. In the book, I have a little story about my work with the author Hunter Thompson. And we had literally just blown up a bomb in his yard in Aspen, Colorado. And afterwards, he looked at me and he said, we've been talking about the presidential election and all these different things. He said, son, do you know what the meaning of the word politics is? And Malcolm, I've been around politics. I've been in campaigns for 25 and 30 years, and I could not answer this most basic question. And he said, son, the meaning of the word politics is the art of controlling your environment. And that's true for not just political campaigns, but for all of businesses and for all entrepreneurs. And that those who control their environment better are able to seize the day. They're the ones that are more successful because they are setting the agenda. They're controlling the terms of the debate. And then other people are reacting to them. In business, it's a term called first mover advantage.
Yes.
And you don't have to look no further than somebody like Tesla and Elon Musk to say, when you're out there and you're the ones defining the agenda, then everyone's reacting to you. And that's a pretty good space to be in.
Yes, yeah, I like that. And carpe diem as well, Matthew, let's move to part 2. Your book, as it says on the front, takes us deeper into creating stronger connections through superior communication strategies. Why and how should today's leaders do this?
You bet. Part 2 of the book, and not just our interview, but all of part 2 of the book focuses on communications planning. Part 1 of the book sort of sets the stage about why it's important, where it comes from, how we even evolved as humans to communicate. The voice box wasn't actually meant for communication. It was another survival tool of how we swallowed, and we just sort of were able to develop it to, from groans and grunts into actual language. Part 2 is about the communications planning. And I offer a communications template in the book about a strategy for how we can approach it. And Malcolm, what I've found is that from a campaign for the president to working with AT&T or energy companies or big environmental organizations to a campaign to win someone's heart, from the personal to the very big level, is that I take clients through a very simple, it can be back of the napkin or it can be a 60-page document. Ask yourself 3 questions, right? Before you say, hey, here's what I always ask, all right, we got this big problem. Well, where do you want to go? What's you're at point A, what's point B?
Yeah.
And that is a critical question that organizations don't ask themselves enough of, because you talk to different people and they're all going in different directions, right? So it's like, let's narrow, get all those horses, pull them in tight. Where are we going? Then we ask ourselves 3 questions. What are we saying? That's the messaging. That's all your context, your history, your research, everything that's gone before and what you expect to go after. The second question is, who are we saying it to? What are our audiences? What are those targets? Sometimes it's just one person. It's the president of the United States, or sometimes it's, these certain group of stakeholders, or it could be a city council vote, or, it could be a person that you're trying to win their heart and mind over a certain thing. And then the last question, which I really love, and this is where I like to play a lot, is how are we going to say it? What are those unique tactics that match up with the messaging and the audiences? Maybe it's an email, but maybe it's better served by a phone call. Or we could write a piece in the paper We could send out a press release or hold a press conference. I could have an event with Warren Zevon and Bob Dylan on the steps of, London Parliament to talk about, the future of the UK. There's all sorts of different ways we can do these things. And especially now in our hyper-connected world, there's almost infinite ways to communicate. But what I encourage clients to do is to pick one or two or three and do them really well. Because oftentimes we're just so scattered, right, out there. So we summarize that. And from, like I said, a 60-page document to sometimes it's just a drink over a beer and the back of the napkin to help a friend through a problem. Where are we going? And then we say, what are we saying, to who, and then how?
Yeah.
Right? Pretty simple. But if we think about that for just a minute, it helps us profoundly in how we approach situations.
I love that. I've worked with some top BBC people and they're managing live shows and everything, and they get it down to one card where they're controlling the whole show.
Yeah. And that's controlling your environment, right?
Yes.
You are controlling that environment in that situation. And when you don't have control in your environment, that's what breeds fear, uncertainty. That's when we say things we don't mean, that we don't know what we're saying. We don't understand what people want from us. A lot of times in good communications, it's about us talking and our messaging, but we so often forget to be good listeners too. Mm-hmm. Malcolm, it's so much harder. I didn't know this until I was writing the book. It takes a lot more energy to listen than it does to talk.
Yeah.
To talk, we can just throw things out there and just like whatever comes to our mind and blah, 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 blah. To listen and to listen well, and then to understand, what does that person need from me? Mm-hmm. What is the empathy? What is my social awareness and emotional intelligence that I'm bringing to this situation? And that's why I really love meetings. You talked about the art of the meeting earlier, and people think I'm crazy, but I love meetings because that's where things get done. Yeah. And you always ask yourself, I have a meditation that I do before I walk into a meeting where I take 3 or 4 or 5 really deep belly breaths and calm my parasympathetic nervous system. And then I ask myself, when I'm in there, what is each person bringing here? What is their value? Why are they here? And then I ask myself that question. What am I bringing? What's my special, unique flavor and sauce that I'm bringing to this situation? Where do I add value?
Yes. I'm totally with you. I think meetings are fun as well because that strategy bit beforehand, and
how people in meetings so much are like talking, they're on their phones and they're on their laptops and they're not paying attention to what people are saying. It drives me batty,
Yeah, but obviously, if they're on their phones, they're not interested in what you're saying. So this, as I say, great value. Matthew, let's move on to my final part. As I said, there's a lot of great value in your book and a lot of content and advice. So let's help viewers and listeners get started. What 3 skills do you think that leaders should focus on early improvement if they are to achieve the ignition goals that your book sets them? Is it, for instance, better presentation, greater approachability, genuine interest in others? What are those 3 priorities?
I mentioned one of them, which is the planning. And that oftentimes when I'm in a big meeting, if you're a big corporation and you work with these corporations, you'll have a meeting with regulatory affairs and legal and the C-suite, and you'll have the communications people, and they all have different interests. And so that planning is so vital. And I believe in that so much. But also you mentioned a couple of other things about the book, like the OODA loop, which OODA is an acronym for observe, orient, decide, act. And it's an old military term that's kind of gone out of fashion, but I think it's so important to bring it to our daily lives, because in that loop, and this is where we get back to the arts of meetings, which are live theater. They really are. A lot of what we do, what we're doing right now is live theater. This is we're in the art of improvisation. And so improvisation, I have a whole chapter on improvisation in the book where we train, we have a professional improviser, if you will, a person that isn't a professional. She's skilled in the art of improvisation and teaches classes. We bring her into clients and do trainings about how to, when you're in a meeting, you're in a situation with colleagues or clients and people bring up ideas. One of the things she brought up to me, which I thought was so profound, how do we support people that we don't agree with? Happens all the time in daily life. Like, God, what a stupid idea. But, we spend a lot of time poo-pooing things or cutting things down or disagreeing. When she said, the art of improvisation, when somebody gives you a bad idea, a really skilled person makes it better. Mm-hmm. They contribute their own value and build upon that. She brought up the example like, Tina Fey and Amy Poehler from Saturday Night Live. If they're in an improv situation and somebody gives them a really terrible idea, first of all, they probably won't work with them again in the future. But she said, you can bet your bottom dollar that Tina Fey and Amy Poehler are going to take a horrible idea and make it the most funniest, brilliant thing you've ever heard in your life. And she goes, what if we can do that in our professional lives? And instead of cutting people down or disagreeing or tearing things up or ignoring people, we make it better.
Yeah.
And that's what our responsibilities as leaders are. Good organizational leaders, that's what they do. They take different things and they see these connections in their head, and then they build upon that. And they don't tear things down.
Yeah, I love doing the mind map in my head in the meeting. Yes, but also I agree with you on when there's many times you're trying to sell something or get something across, and there's somebody, I don't know, well, maybe a Luddite in the boardroom, for example, and I was always told go with them down the line and then gently turn them around. And that's so it's a fascinating. And I say this fascinating book has got so much. Matthew L Moseley says in his book, Ignition, that he has an hypothesis of all the elements of human nature that contribute to our happiness and survival as a species. Communication is the most fundamental. In no way at all do I disagree with him. However, what is also important is that we make effort to learn to communicate effectively, and Matthew's book can be your teacher. Thanks, Matthew, for showing us the way.
Well, thank you so much. What a wonderful conversation today. So fun and lively. And I joke with people that, the only thing I like more than writing is talking about writing.
I can.
And, we didn't get a chance to talk about some of my personal things. I have actually it's 5 different world records in open water.
5?
Swimming.
Wow.
Yeah. I just did a swim for 40 miles, the first ever swim down the Green River through Canyonlands National Park. Really beautiful. It was 40 miles in almost 15 hours. And the only reason I bring it up is because a lot of the same qualities that make me successful in open water and the perseverance and the teamwork and setting audacious goals. These are things that are applicable to our daily lives and in our organizations and businesses. And so, strive for the best, go out there, set some audacious goals and put the team around you and create a vision with a clear approach of where you want to go. What is that other side?
You must come back. We've got lots more to talk about, Matthew.
Much more. And I also want to encourage people, we work with lots of clients around the country and all over the place, and they can reach us at the ignitionstrategygroup.com. I'm also available for speaking gigs and do lots of trainings on communication. So reach out. We're always here. Love to help.